This is Caleb Aylesworth for CG Tuts, and you're watching an Intro to 3ds Max Polygonal Modeling. This is part 1 of the tutorial, the navigation in tools. The software will of course be 3ds Max 2010, and the focus will be on navigation and changing views and shading, the main toolbar and creation menu, the edit poly tools and their functions, and some other random yet important stuff. Okay, so before we begin, let me just talk a little bit about what I'm going to be showing you today. So, first of all, one of the most important things, or probably the most fundamental thing that you need to know in 3D application is how to navigate. This includes orbiting your model, zooming in, zooming out, panning your frame of reference or your window, and also switching between views and different types of shading on your models. So we're going to be looking at that and some different shortcuts on how to do that quickly and more efficiently. We're also going to be looking up here at, this is the main toolbar across the top here. There's a lot of things up there which we're not going to look at for the purposes of this tutorial, but we are going to look at the ones that get used pretty much almost every time you open the application. We're also going to look at the main title bar here, the main menu bar, but once again, most of these don't get used very often, very rarely in cases, or very specific cases where you need certain tools for certain functions. In a regular day-to-day polygonal modeling workflow, you don't really look at those too much, so we'll briefly skim over those. We're also going to be looking over here to the right. You see this little box of tabs up here. This is known as the command panel. We're primarily going to be looking at two buttons of this command panel. The one that shows this little spark here, which is your creation tab. This is what you would use to create anything new in your scene. So geometry, lights, cameras, any types of particles, or even setting up rigs and things you would do from your creation tab. But we're going to be focusing primarily on creating geometry in the form of standard primitives, and well, basically that's it. And then next over is your Modify tab. Now this Modify tab here, this is where you go to modify your individual objects that you've created. So if you create a piece of geometry, you can modify its properties under this Modify tab. If you create a camera or a light, likewise you can modify their properties under the Modify tab. So this is also a very important tab, and we're going to be looking pretty in-depth at the Modify tab as it pertains to geometry and modeling, not so much towards cameras or lighting or anything else. Moving over to that, we have hierarchy, motion, display, and utilities, and we're not really going to be looking at any of those at all today. Now, that being said, the reason that we are going to be skimming past a lot of this stuff and simply just focusing on the modeling aspect of 3ds Max is that 3ds Max is, as I'm sure you're quite aware, one of the largest and most complete 3D apps out on the market. And for that reason, there's no way that you could possibly cover it in its entirety in any one tutorial, or even any one tutorial series for that matter. It would take entire volumes of categorically organized tutorials to cover the entire thing. Probably, tens or hundreds of hours worth of tutorial video. So we're just not going to do that. We'll be focusing on probably one of the most basic key functions of any 3D app, which is polygonal modeling. So now that we've done that little overview, why don't we just get started? So first of all, navigation. I'm just going to maximize my perspective view. You'll see we have our four views here. We have top, front, left, and perspective. Now I can maximize that by hitting Alt-W. And if I hit Alt-W again, it will bring me back to my quad view. So I'm going to maximize it so we can see what we're doing a little more closely here. So now let's talk about some of the navigation buttons. So one of the most useful and important navigation buttons is to just be able to change your focus of what you're looking at within your frame of reference or your view. So to do that in 3D Studio Max, it's very simple. You just click inwards on the mouse wheel in your middle mouse button. Just click down on that and you can pan your view around. Very straightforward. Now, if you want to orbit your object, right now we just have the grid here, so you can't see me orbiting around an object, but if you want to orbit the object, all you do is hold Alt and then click in the middle mouse button, and you can orbit around your object. Pretty straightforward. And lastly, you would also want to be able to zoom in and zoom out, so you can take a look at your object from a distance or zoom right up close to one of the details. So there's two ways to do that. One is just by scrolling the mouse wheel. If you move it forward or up, then that will cause you to zoom in, and if you move it backwards, that will cause you to zoom out. Another way to do it is to hold Control and Alt and then just move your mouse upwards on your mouse pad, or else move it downwards to zoom out. Now, the reason there are these two different methods is one of them is a little more fine-tuned and one of them is a little more choppy. The mouse wheel zooms you in increments. As you can see, it jumps from one distance to another, which is good for quickly zooming in and zooming out. But if you need to get in really close to a specific detail, then you'll probably want to use the Control-Alt method so that you can zoom in continuously and get the exact right distance from your detail. So in a nutshell, that's how to navigate in and around 3D space in 3D Studio Max. Now, the next thing I'm going to look at is changing views. So one way to do it is to maximize your quad view, and then you can say go over to your front view and then hit Alt-W again. Now you're in front view. Actually, to better demonstrate this, I'm just going to throw a box in the scene. I'll explain you how to do that part later, but I'm just putting the box in there now so we can see what we're doing. So once again, I'm in quad view. I can just go and click in my front view and then hit Alt-W, and now I'm in front view. Alt-W again to back out, go over and click in my top view, Alt-W, now we're in top view. That's one way. Another way is, say you want to do that without backing out into your quad view, you can use the hotkeys to do that. So the hotkeys that I use primarily are F for front view, T for top view, and L for left side view. I don't have a hotkey set up for right side view, but you know, I find that looking at one side of the model usually works for me. When I go in orthographic views, I usually turn on wireframe and I can see what's going on the opposite side of the model anyways. But if you really need to, there are other ways to do it. And I'm just going to look at that one right now. So some ways to look at other views of your model. If you look in any one of the views here, I'll just hit P to go back to perspective and maximize. So you have a menu up here to the upper left, and the word perspective is there. So if you click on that, a list of different views will come up here. Primarily, you have perspective, orthographic, top, bottom, front, back, left, and right. And then eventually, if you start adding cameras to your scene, you can change your cameras here too. I'm not really going to look at any of these other options right now because we just don't have time for that. Basically, just focus on the views. So once again, you can click here and go to bottom, or click back up here and say orthographic or perspective, and then you'll go back into your perspective view. So that's another way to do it. And lastly, the one other way that you can navigate your views is this little nifty thing up here in the right corner called the Viewcube. Now, a really easy way to do that is there's this little circle around the Viewcube. You can just grab onto that circle and rotate it around, and that'll rotate around your object. But it doesn't actually rotate you around your object, it actually orbits your view around the object. Or if you click on any one side of this box here, then it'll take you directly to that view. So now I'm in right view. If I click the little arrow, that's going to bring me over to front view. If I click the bottom arrow here, now I'm down in bottom view. Now I'm switched over to back view. And if you take this wheel and spin it, then you can get a 3/4 sort of view. Or if you go into your perspective view, on the sides of these, or on the corners of these view cubes, there's also a little box, and that'll bring you perfectly into a 3/4 view. If you hit that, it'll bring you right into an isometric, exactly 3/4 view of the object. So this view cube is kind of nifty too, especially if you want to work on exact perpendicular or 45-degree angles of your object. then that's a really useful tool as well. So that's views and how to navigate through the views. Next up, I want to show you another really important option in any 3D app, which is how to change your shading mode. So, well, right now you look at this box and it has a little sort of a bounding box around it. On each corner it's got these little white lines hovering over it. That's known as the bounding box. Personally, I don't like it, so to disable it, you can just hit J. I almost never leave that on. If you want to bring it back, you can just hit J again. That's how to get rid of the bounding box. Now when we look at our cube, you'll see that we have these white lines around it when it's selected, and then a slightly lighter version of the object color when it's deselected. That's the wireframe, but we also still have the object color, and we have the shading on it. So that's wireframe shaded view. Now, there are two quick ways to change between these different types of views. The ones that I use primarily are wireframe shaded, shaded view to get rid of the wireframe, so I can just look at the object with its shading on, and just wireframe view. So the way that I prefer to move between these views is to hit F3 to go back and forth between wireframe and shaded view, and F4 to go back and forth between wireframe shaded and shaded view. So once again, F3 for wireframe, F4 to go back and forth between wireframe and wireframe shaded view. Another way to do it is up here under where it says smooth highlights and edge faces. This is new to 3ds Max 2010. If you're using 2009, you won't have this option, but you can actually go in and change some of these views up here too. You can go to smooth and highlights, hidden line, wireframe, and flat shaded. I'm not sure why you would want to use flat shaded unless you just want to really check the silhouette of your object. I don't tend to use it very often. I basically tend to just stay between smooth highlights, turning off edge faces or wireframe shaded, and going to wireframe view. Those are the ones that I like the most. But again, I don't tend to use this. For me, just hitting the hotkeys tends to be a little bit faster. One other way of doing shading, I'm not sure how to access this other than the hotkey, is to go into X-ray mode. X-ray mode is very useful. If you want to, hold on, there we go. X-ray mode is very useful if you want to, say, work from reference. So you have a reference image in your scene, and you want to model, but you still want to be able to see your reference image on the other side of the model. So it's really good to just be able to go back and forth between X-ray and solid shaded mode. So to do that, you just hit Alt-X, and that'll toggle you back and forth between X-ray and shaded mode. So other than that, I think that's pretty much all we need to know for navigating between views and different types of shading. So why don't we just move directly on from there. I'm going to go up to the main menu interface up here, and the first one I'm going to look at is this little bluish green or teal Autodesk 3D Studio Max icon. What that basically is, in any other app, that would be your File menu. So when you open it up, you have things like File New, you can reset. I wouldn't press that if I were you unless you really mess something up and 3D Studio Max is remembering some setting that you didn't want to turn on and is just bugging everything out. Then you hit reset, and that will reset 3D Studio Max to all of the default settings. But the downside to that is you lose all of your customization. So if you customize any hotkeys, anything to your user interface, it'll reset everything. So stay away from that unless it's absolutely necessary. Next you have the Open, and you can browse to open a file, or there's this list to the right here which shows you recent files. So all the recent documents that you've either opened or saved within the last little while, you can actually choose those and open them directly. So that's a nice little time saver. Then next you have Save and Save As. I like Save As personally. I almost never just save, because what Save As does is it allows you to either change the name, or if you look over to the right here, you have this little plus button. I love that plus button because it automatically appends an iteration of your file So instead of saving over your file, it saves a new version and appends a number. Right now you can see my file is named intro max _0. If I hit plus, it's now going to save it as intro to max _01. And as you can see up here, it says that it'll show you the last file that you saved, and that's intro to max 01. So that's very useful because if anything gets corrupted or you lose any work in any way, Max crashes, you can always go back to an older version of the file before it was messed up, rather than saving over your work. So very useful save as option. Then we have import and export. I won't be looking at those today, but that's where you would be able to import either different types of 3D file formats, OBJs, meshes exported from other softwares like ZBrush or even Autodesk Maya or some other 3D Studio or 3D application. You can import meshes from there. You can also merge objects from other 3D Studio Max files without actually opening the file. So that's really useful too, because if you want to just import one element from the scene, you can do that using this merge button here. And then export is your standard export. You can export the 3D Studio Max 3D model using a various number of different types of file formats and export them to different applications or even to a video game engine. Those are the only ones I'm going to look at for now. And actually, under the rest of this, I'm not really going to look at anything else. We have customize. I'll briefly mention that as well. The only one that I'm going to talk about is customize user interface. Under customize user interface, this is where you can go in and set up your hotkeys. So you have all the different names here, and then you have the hotkey button. So you can either go in here and type in a hotkey, say W, and it'll tell you what it's assigned to already. Select and move, which is a very important manipulator function, so I don't want to overwrite that one. But you can basically just look for different keys by typing them in. I is assigned to pan viewport, L is assigned to left view. So you can just kind of look through there and see if anything is unassigned before you try to assign your hotkey. And then you can scroll down here through all of your various different operations and choose what function you want to assign a hotkey to. So that can be very useful. And then at the bottom here you can just save it. You can also save various different sets of hotkeys and then load them. So you might have hotkeys for modeling and different set of hotkeys for, say, texturing or unwrapping rather, or different hotkeys for animating. So you can save those and say, one hotkey name is animation, another one is set to modeling. You can load those at different times. So once again, very useful. That's under customize user interface. One other thing that's useful under the customize menu here is preferences. I won't go through everything under the preferences, but you can change some things in here. So it might be good to try to look over those at some point. One that I tend to always check or use fairly often if it gets reset is down here under viewports and choose driver. You can choose what your driver is. I tend to use DirectX. And then you can also configure the driver. And without getting into it too much, you'll notice under appearance or background texture size and download texture size, I have it set to the maximum, 1024 and 512. This will become important when you start texturing your models and viewing them in 3D Studio Max. If you have it set on the lower settings, your texture will not display as it actually looks in Photoshop or whatever other application you're using or your game engine. So you need to turn it up to the maximum, 1024 and 512, and then say OK. And that will display your textures the way they should. So we've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to keep moving on. So now let's look at the main toolbar along the top here. So these are linking tools. I won't look at those too much. Find a space warp, won't look at. This here is a selection filter. So you can decide, when you click on objects in the scene, if you only want to select your geometry, you can say just geometry. Say you had like a bunch of lights or cameras or other things in your scene, and they're getting in the way and you don't want to select those, then you can just choose geometry. Likewise, you can choose only lights or cameras or whatnot, bones, if you're doing animation. So that can be kind of useful. We also have over here select by name, so I'm just going to add another object in the scene just to illustrate my point. I'll add a cylinder. So under select by name, now I have box 1 and cylinder 1. So say you had a lot of objects in your scene and you knew the name of the specific object that you wanted to select. You could just select it by name here. And once again, you have filters along the top here. So if you only want to show geometry or only want to show lights, you can do that along the top here as well. So also pretty useful in terms of selecting things quickly and efficiently. Next we have our Marquee tool. This is also very useful. You can use this to select numerous objects at once or only select one object. So that's very useful. And while we're on the topic of selection, I'll mention how to select multiple things by clicking on them and deselect as well. So if you click on one object and then click on another object, it will deselect the object that you were clicking on and select the one that you tried to select afterwards or tried to click on afterwards. If you want to click on objects and select multiple objects, just hold down Control. And then by holding Control and clicking on the object again, it will deselect it. So that's how to select multiple objects. Or again, you can just use the Marquee tool. And then you have different shapes of marquees. You have your circle marquee, so if you had rounder objects, that might be more useful. And then you actually have your Polygonal Marquee, where you can actually draw the shape of your marquee. You can drag it out and sort of just draw around what you want to select. So that's kind of neat and useful. I don't really use it very often though. And I actually have this new sort of spray paint marquee where you can actually just click and hold and drag your cursor around the screen. And as long as you don't let go, anything that you pass your cursor over top of will become selected. So that's kind of neat. A little gimmicky, but you know, I could see the use for it. Most of the time though, I just leave it on the rectangle marquee. So after that, the next thing I'm going to look at is the Manipulator Tools. These are very useful. In fact, you will use them every single time you open the application. So the Manipulator Tools are basically Translate, which allows you to move your object in the scene. You can either move it on just the Z-axis by pressing and holding on the blue arrow, just the Y-axis by using the green arrow, or just the X-axis by using the red arrow, or you can move it along only two axes, so you can constrain it just to the Y and X axis. If you don't want to move it up and down, then you can keep it away from the Z, or you can constrain it to Z and X or Z and Y. Now the next tool on the list of manipulator tools here is the Rotate tool. Rotate tool, much like the Move tool, has a gizmo here that you can use in various different capacities. So what it does is it will basically rotate the object around its pivot point. So if you want to rotate it along the Y-axis, simply grab the green circle. If you want to rotate it along the X-axis, simply grab the red circle. And along the Z-axis, grab the blue circle. Just like that. Or, for some reason the red circle will make it rotate along the Z, and the blue circle will make it rotate along the X in this instance. So that's the Rotate tool. Pretty straightforward. Lastly, we have the Scale tool. Once again, you have a series of red, blue, and green handles, and some yellow ones in the middle. So let me just explain to you what those do. So the blue one will scale the object on Z. X will scale the object on, red will scale the object on X, and green will scale the object on Y. And once again, it will scale from the pivot point. So if the pivot point is in the center of the object, it will scale from the center outwards. But if the pivot point is on the bottom of the object, the way that it is here, then it will scale in only one direction, away from or towards that pivot point. The next thing that you can do is you can scale, once again, by constraining only to two axes, by grabbing this little yellow portion that bridges between the two handles. Or you can scale uniformly from the center by grabbing the very middle of the gizmo. So that's the scale tool. It's fairly simple, fairly easy to use. Now at this point I just want to show you one more thing that works in conjunction with the scale very nicely, and that is this little button up here, which can tell you where to scale from or what to use as the pivot point. So you can choose to use the center of the object, which is this one, or rather the center of the selection. You can choose to use the pivot point center, which is this other icon here, and if you hover over it, it will tell you which one is which. Or you can actually choose to use the center of the world, which is not so apparent when the object is here, but when we put the object up here, and then we choose to use the center of the world for scaling, as you can see, it scales closer to or farther away from the center of world space. I don't use that one very often. I tend to stay mostly on pivot point center, and occasionally on center of the selection. And the same goes for the move tools as well, or the move and rotate tools. You can also change that pivot point, and that will affect your manipulator gizmos. Now, I just want to show you one other way to select these gizmos. It's the one that I use more often. I don't tend to use these three buttons up here: select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale. I tend to use the hotkeys, which are W for move or translate, E for rotate, and R for scale. Once again, W for translate, E for rotate, and R for scale. So that's a quick way to change between those manipulator tools. One other thing that I want to show you is the scale tool itself has a little flyout. It has the uniform scale, which will scale everything uniformly. And then it has the next button here, which is non-uniform scale. So that will work with this little dialog box, which, by the way, you can get on any of these manipulator tools, by right-clicking on them. So if you right-click on the move tool, you get a move dialog box. If you right-click on the scale, rotate, you get a rotate dialog box. And if you right-click on the scale and transform, you get the scale and transform dialog box. Now, if that were on uniform scale, you would have this one little slider here, or value box, value field, which represents all of the different axes. So you can just move this slider up and down, or you can input a value, and that will scale it uniformly on all different axes. Or you can also do it on each axis individually. And right-clicking on any of those will actually zero them out. I tend not to do that with scale because it will flatten the object completely out into nothing. But, for instance, say you were to do that with the translate tool. Say I were to take my object and just throw it out in space. And say I wanted to get it centered back into the center of world space. So what I could do is I could right-click on these here, and it will actually zero my object out back into the center of world space. So that's very useful, just for making sure things are, completely centered and back to normal. But you'll notice if I change to non-uniform scale, then I have the absolute local fields, which will scale it on the local axis, and I also have the offset world, which I can then change each axis individually. So that's the last one. And then we have a squash option, which will actually stretch and squash the object on all the various different axes, depending on which one that we're pulling or pushing on. Now this one's not very useful for modeling. It comes in more handy when you're animating and you want to make something look like it's got some secondary motion or some bounce to it. Say you were doing a rubber ball or something and you wanted to make it look like it was smushing down when it was hitting the ground, then you could use this stretch and squash scale option, and that would be very useful for that. So right here, now this is our reference coordinates, the one that says view here. We have view, we have screen, we have world, local, gimbal, grid, and so on. What this does is it basically will cause the gizmo to align itself to certain coordinates. View will cause the gizmo to align to the view. So that means that the Y will be facing Y, X will be facing X, and Z will be facing Z, according to the actual three-dimensional views. If you go to screen, the gizmo will change, and it will always align itself to your screen. So even if you're in, some sort of oblong, three-quarter sort of view, you will still actually be able to scale the object perpendicular to the screen. I don't use it for scale very often, only in very rare circumstances. What I tend to use screen for more is for moving or translating, because then you can actually take the object and line it up and just translate it perpendicular to your screen, which sometimes can be a little bit more difficult or annoying to move things in a certain direction if the gizmo is locked to these axes, which are perpendicular to your view plane. So say I wanted to just look at the object from here, and I wanted to try and move it exactly sideways, perpendicular to my view. I couldn't do that right now, because my gizmo is aligned to my actual 3D views. So I could just take this and turn it to screen, and now I can move it exactly sideways, or exactly vertical compared to my view. So that's kind of useful. World will offset it to world space. That doesn't really affect it differently when you're dealing with a single object, but if you have multiple objects, they will all offset in different directions based on world space coordinates. I don't tend to use that one very often. The one that I tend to use the most is view, screen, or local. Now what local will do is it will align the gizmo to the object's pivot point, which is right now aligned to the views, so there's no difference between local and view at the moment. But say I were to take the object and rotate it, like that. Now if I were to try to translate the object based on view, the gizmo would still be aligned to the 3D view plane. But say, what if I want to translate the object so it moves perpendicular to the object itself, to its orientation and not to the view plane? Then I can move to local, and now I can move the object perpendicular to itself, to its own pivot point. So that is also very useful. And the same goes for rotate. Right now, if I want to rotate the object, it only rotates based on the 3D views. But if I change to local, I can now rotate the object based on its own pivot point. So these buttons come in very handy too when trying to navigate. Okay, let's keep moving forward. After that, I'm going to skip these two because I don't find them very useful. Here are snaps. Snaps is very useful as well because it will actually snap your cursor to the grid. So you can, later on I'll show you, you can grab a vertex and snap it to various different points on the grid. And then you have various different degrees of snapping, 2, 2.5, and 3. Default is 3. I usually leave it on 3. And then you have rotation snaps. And I use rotation snaps quite often because if you turn rotation snaps on, it will snap in increments of 5 degrees, which means that you can very easily rotate an object to 90 or 45 degrees. And you'll be able to see that by watching the yellow numbers change in the center of the screen there. So you can see right now I've rotated it 180 degrees. And it snaps by 5 degree increments. Whereas if I were to turn that off, it would free rotate and that snaps by 1/100ths of a degree increments, which is very precise if you need to rotate something precisely, but it's not very quick if you need to line something up exactly to a certain degree, like a 45 or a 90. So once again, snap's very useful. I'm going to skip the rest of these here, and the only ones I'm going to show you after that are the material editor. The material editor is almost like its own application in 3D Studio Max. It's very deep and complicated, and if I do a tutorial later on introductions to unwrapping and materials in Max, I'll get into it in more detail. But you can find it up here in the main toolbar with this little checkered sphere. And at this point in time, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you how to apply a material. So at the beginning, all materials are just named default 1, default 2, default 3, and it's just a gray blend material. So this little arrow here is how you assign it to an object. So you can either assign it by clicking on this arrow and having an object selected, and that will assign to the object, and Control Z to undo, by the way. Or you can drag it over to your selection by just grabbing the material and dropping it on top of your selection, which is also very easy. And then if you have any sort of other material maps applied down here, then you will need to enable them in the viewport as well, which right here, this little button with the checker and the light bulb, is how you can turn it on and off in the viewport. But we don't have any of those applied right now, so you will not see the effect of that. But I'm just going to drag my gray standard blend material over to this box. And that's the material editor in short. So why don't we get started looking at some actual modeling stuff now? I think we've spent enough time looking at various different manipulation tools and navigation tools. Let's get right into the meat of the modeling. So to create objects, polygonal objects in 3D Studio Max, there are many different ways, but the most common way is just by creating a standard primitive object and then converting it to an editable polygonal object or edit poly object, which will give you or open up a vast array of different functions. So to do that, you need to go up here to your Creation tab, which is part of your command panel. Is this little spark here, and then you need to choose Geometry, which is the first one, and it just looks like an icon of a sphere. And then underneath this, you have a bunch of different types of objects: standard primitives, extended primitives, compound objects, particle systems, and so on and so forth. But for polygonal modeling, the one that I use mostly is standard primitives. So I'll just be looking at that. Under standard primitives, to create an object, you just click the object. I'm going to use a basic box. And then you just click anywhere in your viewport, hold down with the left click, and drag it out to get one dimension, or rather 2 dimensions, and then let go of the left click and drag it vertically to get the 3rd dimension. And that's how you get your box. Now, you'll notice that underneath this box, when we first create it, there's a bunch of options here. So we can change these options. If we want to make the box an exact specific size, we can go under parameters here, and I can say I want the box to be 5. Actually, that's kind of huge. 5 meters. Why don't we go with 1.5 meters by 1.5. You can just enter in a value, and then hit enter. 1.5. Enter. Something else that you can do, and before I continue on, I'm just going to zero this out as I showed you before by right-clicking on the Select and Move tool, and then right-clicking on, sorry, I need to change this back to View, and I need to change the Scale tool back to Select Uniform Scale. And then what that's going to do is that's going to allow me to zero, pardon me, I'm still on the Scale tool there, on my Select and Move. And that's going to allow me to zero out the box in world space once again, so it's centered in world space. So now Now that I've deselected my box, you'll notice that all of my options that were there before are gone. That will bring me to my next point, which is the Modify tab, which is the next one over from the Create tab. So once you've created something in 3D Studio Max, and you deselect away from it, you will lose its properties. So to get them back, or to modify them, you have to go over to the Modify tab, which is just to the right of the Create tab. So when we click on that, excuse me, you'll notice that, pardon me, I've got a scratch in my throat there. You'll notice that there are many different properties that we can modify here. We have the name, which I'll call for now test object. Sorry, I selected away from it. And it's always good to name your objects, because when you get a scene with tons of different objects, or if someone else needs to open it up while you're away or something in a production environment, it's nice for them to be able to, say, okay, this is big box number 1 or small box. And the more specific they get, then the more specifically you should try to name them, rather than having them open up a scene and having box number 10,002 or something like that. So anyways, as you can see, I'm in my Modifier tab now, and my properties are back. So I always by default leave this Generate Mapping Coordinates on, and Real World Map Scale off. Those are the defaults. I don't ever really change those. Once again, I showed you that you can change the values of the length, width, and height by either moving the slider interactively or entering in a value. The other thing that you can do is you can add segments. You can add length segments, or you can add width segments, or height segments, or both. I usually tend not to add any of those. And once again, right-clicking on any of these little arrow sliders will bring them back to their zeroed out. In this case, it's not 0, it's 1, 1. So I tend not to add any segments at this stage when I'm creating an object and it's still a standard primitive. I usually add all that stuff later on when I convert it to an editable poly. So before I go and do that though, I'm just going to show you a few of these other standard primitives. So we have our box, we have our sphere, which is your basic sphere, and once again you can change its radius, you can change the number of segments, so you can make it a very, very basic primitive sphere, or you can bump it right up, and if we go into shaded view, you can't tell it's a polygonal object at all, because it's so smooth. So that's the sphere. And then you can actually even change the hemisphere here. So rather than having a whole sphere, you can just create half of a sphere, or just a segment of a sphere. But once again, I don't tend to use that very often, unless there's a very specific application for that. You can also decide if you don't want it to be smooth, but I rarely do that. I usually turn smoothing on. And you can choose to squash it if you like. But I tend not to use that very often. I mostly just edit the radius and the segments when dealing with spheres. I'll just delete that one and move on to the next. We have a cylinder. Cylinder, very useful. I usually get rid of the height segments, and I tend to, for game models, tend to not go lower than 8, unless it's a very small object which you won't get up too close or you won't really notice the silhouette. I tend to try to stick somewhere between 8 and 18. Sometimes it calls for higher, like around 24, or even up into the 30s, but that's rare. I like to try to stick between 8 and 18, and mostly between 8 and 12. So that's a cylinder. Once again, you can add your height segments, or you can add cap segments. I tend not to use those at all. And then we have a bunch of other stuff here which I tend not to really use. Mostly the three primitives I use are box, sphere, and cylinder. You can play around with the others in your own time. I'm not going to show them too much in this tutorial, as they're self-explanatory, and it might be fun for you to mess around with them yourself. Likewise, if you go up here where standard primitives is, you can try messing around with the extended primitives as well. After that, I wouldn't really try too much. Compound objects, particle systems, and those kind of things will need a little bit of explanation. So just stick to standard and extended primitives and have a little bit of fun messing around with those.